How you doing there? Just a quickie before we start. On the Apple podcast, why don't you double click on David McWilliams Plus? It's right there when you open the podcast. You get ad-free, you unlock early access. Just double click and away you go. David McWilliams Plus. You get this pure and simple. To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It's podcast time. John and I are discussing whether you do pints before wine or after wine.
Yeah, it's never a good mix, Mac. It's never a good mix.
And I'm suffering a little bit.
What's the phrase, the grape and grain?
Yeah, I never really could have understood that. So you have the grape first and the grain thereafter? Or is it the grain first and the grape thereafter? Anyway, not least, it was one of those nights.
Yeah.
One of those nights.
Big banging head on you.
Big banging head. But a good head, though. A good head in me. Good head and good chats.
Yeah.
I thought it made absolutely loads of sense last night. I thought, absolutely, the world is completely soft. But today we're going to talk part 2 of our immigration.
Yes, indeed.
Before we chat about other stuff, the podcast is going to be on part 2, which is last week we were chatting about immigration, giving you facts, data, statistics on why immigration is unambiguously good for the economy. There's no doubt of that.
Yeah.
But this week, we're going to talk about, yes, it's unambiguously good, but what happens? I'll give you the economic sort of parameter framework, John, is that, so if you think about free trade is unambiguously good for an economy.
Yeah.
But different people get affected differently. So when, for example, the Americans opened up to Japanese cars in the 1960s and 70s, initially, Americans thought Toyotas in particular were kind of Mickey Mouse cars, right? But what Toyota did is they made available to Americans really good cars that were really cheap. So free trade meant that the average American car buyer was better off, right?
Yeah.
So in the aggregate, Americans were better off because cars were cheaper and Americans like to buy cars as we know. But people in Detroit, for example, were not better off because people in Detroit were the Motor City, were all employed in the car industry. So in the aggregate, Americans were better off, but specifically a place like Detroit was destroyed. And it's a city that we know has suffered immeasurably as a result of that. Right? So the thing is, yes, free trade benefits everybody, but it benefits some people more than others. And it negatively affects certain people. And therefore, the question is, once you have free trade, is it important? Is it absolutely essential to listen to the anxieties of those who are badly affected? Now, the only person, as you know, who articulated the feeling of Detroit was Eminem.
That's true.
8 Mile. The only person who actually put Detroit on the map in the 1990s was a white rapper from a trailer park.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
So immigration is the same thing. In the aggregate, immigration absolutely works, but certain people get affected worse than others.
Yeah.
And the title of the podcast before we have a little natter is whether immigration is a class issue. So the middle class, like ourselves, experience immigration completely differently to the working class.
Yeah.
Right? Who are competing with immigrants in various different areas. And that maybe explains some of the anger on the street.
Yeah. And of which there is a lot, and it's growing.
There is a lot.
It's very palpable in Dublin at the moment.
Well, but before we're going to go back to before you were mentioning Public Enemy just there before we came on.
Yeah, I was flicking through Twitter there earlier on, and there was a great picture from May 1988.
I remember it well.
When Public Enemy played in the POV in Trinity College.
They played the Trinity Ball.
Yes, in 1980. And there's a great picture from the stage looking out on this just probably 200-300 people, which you were in there. I was in there.
Yes.
But we weren't together for some reason.
No, we weren't, which is bizarre. I was avoiding you at the plague. But I remembered that.
What was really funny just about the picture is that we're all kind of scraggly. We all dressed terribly in the late 80s. But everyone had this big bewildered face on them. Well, every single person.
I remember that so distinctly because it was an afternoon gig, which is always a bad thing, right? It's always a bad thing, right? And you'd Public Enemy strutting around with their pretend machine guns, right? On the stage, right? And Flavor Flay and Chuck D, and they were doing this. But that night they played the Trinity Ball. And I remember distinctly, Trinity Ball, it was at 4 a.m. they played, right? It was the last gig. It was in New Square in Trinity. And they come out, and they're quite menacing at this stage. And the lights go down, and it's really heavy. And Chuck D is there, and Flavor Flay, and Chuck D is going, fight the power. And he's going, fight the power, call out to the crowd. The crowd, who are all white, middle class kids, are going, fight the power. I'm like, we are the fucking power.
It just didn't connect.
It didn't connect. I'm looking, man, white guys and girls in dinner jackets.
Yes,
and
we were all dicky
and
up.
like, dinner jackets, and like taffeta fucking gowns and everything. Go and fight the power to these guys. And I'm looking, and you can see your man Chuck D going, okay, I've got to go with this because I'm the lead singer.
Yeah, you were all studying to be bankers.
The uber privileged going, fight the power. But it's one of the great songs, though.
Yeah.
It's one of the great songs. And on songwriting, John, Burt Bacharach.
Oh, man.
Favorite of yours?
Yeah, well, he's
94. Good
94. And he wrote, his first big hit was 1952. That's how long he's been at it. And he's written some absolutely fantastic songs.
Amazing songs. And created amazing careers for people.
Yeah. Actually, Elvis Costello did a whole album with him.
He did?
And it was fantastic. I'm not a huge fan, I have to say, but he was just...
Of Bacharach? Oh, I am a big fan.
It was real kind of...
It's my saccharine poppy side to
yes,
it. I love that. Yeah. I love all that stuff.
Because you're at 70s.
I'm a 70s man. If I could, I'd be in a Ford Capri. I'd be in an orange Ford Capri with a tash and a pair of flares.
And collars on your shirt that would go all the way down to your ankles.
Although in the 70s, early 70s, or late 70s, early 80s, one of the great renditions of a Burt Bacharach song was Walk On By the Stranglers.
Yes,
the Stranglers did a version of it. So you have the Dionne Warwick, the lovely, strings and all that sort of things. And then you have the Stranglers just with the heavy bass. Anyway, sorry, we digress. How are you anyway? Sunshine, have you had a good week?
I've had a really, really busy week, which is always good to be busy. But I have to say, one thing I have been reading and looking at and following is the awful tragedy of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria.
Horrendous.
Like to date, as we're recording, the death toll is touching 25,000, which is mind-boggling numbers.
That's a huge number.
But I read a really interesting piece by your mate, Elif Shafak,
yes,
on the weekend, on the FT, pointing the finger squarely at Erdogan for his lack of investment and lack of preparation. Because in fairness, the EU and the Greeks in particular responded immediately to the disaster. But Erdogan and the Turkish central government was really slow. But it got me thinking, and I don't want to go on about this, but it got me thinking about...
By the way, when John says, I don't want to go on about this, he goes on about this. Settle in. Get yourself a cup of tea, a packet of digestive biscuits, the chocolate ones, maybe a
hobnobs,
a Kit Kat, maybe milk, and a box of milk tray. Go on. Should we go?
But no, because, and this is my point, is because we're going to talk about immigration.
Yeah.
Natural disasters has a big impact on immigration.
Sure.
And when you look at Turkey and Syria and stuff, along with the wars, the economic disaster, all that kind of stuff, but then you throw in a big natural disaster on top of that. And it adds fuel to the fire. People, of course, are going to leave earthquake-prone area and not come back. And why should they?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the history of humanity, there's push and pull factors in immigration, but natural disasters are one of the major push factors. You're just like, I'm not going to hang it there. And interesting you say about this place. I've been in the city, Gaziantep, right? So Gaziantep.
Right.
So about 5 years ago, I was asked to do a talk for Syrian refugees from Aleppo. And the Syrian refugees from Aleppo...
What are you going to talk to them about?
No, for them. Raise money for them in Turkey. Right?
Talk to them. Talking at them.
Exactly.
What the fuck is this?
Yeah. Well, and actually, so the refugee camp was in Gaziantep. So this exact area. So Aleppo is about, I think, 50 miles from Gaziantep. Okay. Gaziantep is an enormous... I'd never actually heard of it, right? I'd heard of... There's a mosaic... Typical me. There's a mosaic museum in Gaziantep, and I'd heard of that. Right? So it's all these Roman and Greek mosaics, which is really fascinating. Discovered, again... by accident, possibly after a natural disaster that unearthed them.
Unearthed. Yeah. Okay.
But so I went with Lucy, and we went to the refugee camp on the border to see the folk who we were raising money for. Because I said to the Turks, I want to go and chat to these
You need
people.
to understand it, yeah.
Yeah, and Gaziantep is extraordinary. It's a city of 3 million people. I had never heard of it. Huge, huge city.
Yeah.
And the people, it was interesting, the taxi driver was chatting away and they were talking about the Syrians. And you forget, it's really funny, Syrians and Turks, obviously Muslims, but they don't speak each other's language. They can't read each other's alphabet.
Oh, right.
Because one is in Arabic, So it was really weird. And there was many hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees there. And that's the epicenter. And you just think, particularly for the Syrians, what have they done to deserve their fate in the last 10 years? Everything that, if you were born in Syria of our generation, or the generation coming after us, right? You're born in a reasonably civilized country, peaceful, although Assad was a dictator, but he was, if you decided that you were going to actually go along with it, everything was fine. They were the good education system, good financial system, good economy, everything. Now the country is a total mess. And the only comparison, remember we were talking about Germany in the Middle Ages the other day? The only comparison is Germany in the 30 Years' War, where people have been destroyed. And now, on top of this, you get this, natural disaster. And as you said, people will leave and they'll be on the move.
Yeah.
And immigration, so I mean, you're right. The idea here is that immigration is a fact of life.
Yes.
And it's a fact of modern society. It is a fact of 8 billion people in the world. And what do you do about it? And there's people in Ireland saying, okay, that's it. Ireland is full. But that ain't going to stop immigration. So the question then is to try and understand people's anxieties. And I think that's where we're going to go today, to say, okay, are different people affected differently? And if they are, is it absolutely essential to acknowledge that?
Okay, Mark, just before you go there, let's just take a quick break for this.
Absolutely. So obviously, John, as you said, 25,000 people dead. People are going to move. Lots of people are going to say, well, I'm not going to hang out here anymore.
Yeah.
I'm going to move. So immigration is the biggest issue at the moment in Ireland. I think it's probably one of the biggest issues everywhere in Europe. And it is the one that is igniting people. And the protests we see on the streets in Ireland, I think they are despicable. And I think there's hate crime. And I think someone's going to be killed. The level of violence and anger is so extreme. It's very, very clear that the National Party, whatever they're called, are trying to weaponize immigration to try and build a political platform. There's no doubt, right? And how they're doing it is street protests, et cetera, et cetera. But interesting, the latest data, right? Let's go back to data, right? The latest data from Ireland is kind of interesting, right? So Kev Cunningham, who's been on the show, friend of the show, all around good lad, loves his data, gets into surveys and analysis and mines the data. He has a company called Ireland Thinks, and they do surveys. And I think it was for the Irish Indo, the Sunday Indo last week.
Okay, right. Yeah,
and the Sunday Indo published this thing, and it's very interesting. So it broke down attitudes to immigration, not by class, not by income, but by political affiliation. So what party, right? And then, of course, you can do your own echo from there, right?
Yeah.
Now, the fascinating thing, and it's a big problem for Sinn Féin, largely a working class party. 61% of all people who intend to vote Sinn Féin want immigration to stop. They believe that Ireland has enough refugees and that's it.
Yeah.
Now, this is a big problem for Sinn Féin because the Sinn Féin leadership is very liberal.
Yes.
And it's very much that this is one world and we're going to look after everybody. But the grassroots of Sinn Féin say we don't want more immigrants. Contrast that with Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, the middle class, centrist vote, much more likely to be tolerant. Well, not much more likely to be tolerant. I think it's 47% of Fine Gael voters, right, say Ireland has too many. But way out in front are, of course, Sinn Féin.
But that is odd with Sinn Féin, given that a core part of the Sinn Féin philosophy is nationalism as well.
That's the thing. So you've
liberal nationalism.
It's liberal nationalism. So what the Sinn Féin leaders are doing is it's like archbishops dancing on the head of a needle, right? Do you remember that expression about? So because what they're trying to do, they're trying to appeal. First of all, they've got the Chucky R law, right?
Yeah.
32 county republic, right? So nationalism. ethnic Irish,
Yeah.
the
Wrap
Irish
yourself in the
race,
tricolour.
all that carry on, right? Okay. That's one time which both you and I, you qualify. I don't think I qualify for their ethnocentric, ethno-nationalist view of the world. Okay. That's what, but
My
on the
ma
other,
does.
but exactly, but the other side of them is a sort of an internationalist leftist idea, which is that all workers are the same.
Yes. Yeah.
Stemming largely from it's a Marxist idea, right? Again, so they've got these two intellectually difficult things to reconcile: the ethnocentric, ethno-nationalist, all workers are the same except for Irish workers are better than everybody else,
Yeah.
and then all workers are the same, right? But of course, their voters are largely working class people, and then working class people are much more likely to compete with immigrants. So economists use this awful expression, excuse me while I use it, right?
Go on.
Okay, is whether or not you are in competition or you're complemented by something, right?
Okay.
So in competition, we know what it means, makes sense. You're full on in competition. You win, I lose. Complementary is we both win at the same time. So the argument is that immigrants, because they compete, first of all, in the job markets, right? They compete in the public health market, like they turn up at A&Es, even though we know immigrants don't turn up as much as locals, right?
Yes. That's
Public
true.
schools, and of course housing, and housing waiting list. And housing is the big issue. We'll come back to it in a minute, right? So if you are already feeling the squeeze, if you're already feeling that you might be left behind, if you're already feeling that life is a huge struggle, immigrants complicate that enormously for you. Take the middle class voters, right? Middle class voters see immigrants, and what they meet them in shops, they meet them in hotels, they meet them in restaurants. They are the people who are in the service industry.
Yeah.
So they are actually providing services for the middle class folk. And with the exception of housing, which is a universal issue, middle class people's perceptions of immigration is completely different. So with economists, the problem with economists is economists say the economy gets workers, and I suffer from this too. The economy gets workers, but the society gets people. And immigrants are people.
Right.
And
Yes.
that's the whole idea.
Yeah.
And this is the idea that culture will always trump economics, because culture actually speaks to people's hearts, whereas economics speaks to people's heads.
Yes.
And your head is great for analysis and all this sort of stuff, but at the end you vote. It's this extraordinary thing I've always felt so different. It's how do you feel about things is much more important than what do you know about things. And people feel threatened. These people are feeling threatened. And we can talk ad nauseum about the aggregate of how brilliant we know for economics immigrants are. But actually, for people's lives, they're feeling threatened. And if you look at just one thing, so Shinners, so working class people who vote for Sinn Féin feel threatened.
Yeah, and I understand that, and in many ways that's absolutely fair enough. You don't want to have to compete when things are hard enough. You don't want to have to compete further for housing and for jobs and all the rest. But it's the boyos who our culture, our country,
Burn them out.
Yeah, the burn them out bullshit of,
But that is bullshit.
because in some way it's going to lessen the Irishness of Ireland. And as we spoke before about, it actually complements, it can enhance.
Of course it does.
Multiculturalism enhances, and it's inevitable.
It's inevitable. Number one, it's inevitable. Number two, as I said to you before, Irish culture and North Face jackets seem to be going together, right? It's the North Face revolution. I have a skin fade, a North Face jacket, and away we go, right? But my point is that those of us who want to welcome immigrants probably need to be aware of the fact that there is a real anxiety out there.
Yeah.
As evidenced by the fact that over half of all Irish voters say this is a problem. So this is becoming a mainstream issue. Now, obviously, you're absolutely right. Top of people's agenda, cost of living and housing. They're the two big things.
Yeah.
But percolating under is immigration, and we need to figure out what we're going to do about it. And if you look at Brexit, so you look at the UK, right? In 2020, a report in the wake of Brexit by Oxford University on immigration looked at the facts of immigration in terms of how it affects different levels of society, right? And what they found is that every 1%, this is interesting, this was EU immigrants, so they're trying to explain where the Brexit vote came from, right? But the data is interesting. It says every 1% increase in EU migrants in the UK led to a 0.8% decrease in the wages of native workers in the bottom 10%.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
And interestingly, a 0.6% increase in the wages of the highest earners. Now, this is fascinating. So what is happening is that immigration is competing against the lowest earners, decreasing their wages.
Yeah.
But it's complementing the wages of higher earners. Why? Because those immigrants that are very, very, very skilled are actually pushing up the aggregate wage at the very, very top because they're actually dragging everything up, right?
Right.
So what you're getting is this complete discombobulation between the two extremes. Now, over time, these disparities, they sound small, but over time, these disparities add up. So this study by the University of Oxford, over a quarter of a century, so over the 25 years where EU immigration in the UK after the fall of the Berlin Wall became a thing, what they see is that immigration into the UK led to a reduction of wages, 4.9% amongst the poorest 10% of workers.
That's significant.
Exactly. And a 4.4% increase in the top 10%.
Wow.
So what you're seeing is actually immigration from the EU for the Brits at the very extreme impacted poorer people much more negatively. And not only didn't it not negatively impact rich people, it actually enhanced rich people's real wages.
Right.
So that is pretty much kind of the deal, right? That immigration affects people disproportionately. And then you throw in public services, and then you throw in public housing.
Yeah.
And what you have is a legitimate concern on the part of poorer people about what is going on. And again, if you look at, for example, another fascinating study, and this is all important to get it out because people like you and I who are on the liberal side can only win the arguments by being very honest and very transparent that those who are not on our side have some legitimate concerns. If you look, again, this is a fascinating study by the National Bureau of Economic Research in the States, right? And this, again, is slightly incendiary, but it's interesting.
Okay.
So they tried to take this view of, they take the Black American population, the African American population, as being broadly the poorest part of the United States. And they're trying to explain what happened in upward social mobility amongst Black people in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So in the 1960s, so you think the Condoleezza Rices, the Cosby Show, Obama, these are the fact that there seems to have been, at least in the 70s and 80s, a significant improvement in the Black population's economic progress, right? And this is something that Americans from the civil rights movement in the 60s were hoping for, right? The civil rights movement comes in, it changes legislation, you cannot discriminate against people. And over time, what you'll find is upward social mobility amongst Black Americans.
Sure. Yeah.
And then that stops in the 80s and 90s. So people are trying to figure out, why does it stop?
Yeah.
Right? Why has that stopped, right? Now, again, this is the National Bureau of Economic Research talks about immigration hurting Black people more than white people in the United States, right? Because of competition in the jobs market and the housing market and the health market and the education market, etc. And they found between 1980 and 2000, and this is quite a long study, 20 years, that immigration, largely, I think, from Latin America, they're talking about, explains between about 20 and 60%, depending on region. Now, think about this, right? Of the decline in Black people in America who have less than a college education, right?
Okay.
So poor, undereducated African Americans, they've seen their wages decline. A 25% decline in all employment, so not only wages, but all employment of African Americans, and a 10% increase in incarceration rates.
Okay.
Right. So what they're saying is that jobs that used to be done by African Americans are now being done by immigrants. I would say largely Latin Americans, but maybe Asians as well. And this over time has had this progressive impact on the welfare of African Americans. And it makes sense, but what it does is it reinforces the idea that the poor get affected incredibly disproportionately by immigration.
Right.
And then you think, okay, this then, of course, adds to people's perception of race issues. And there's another fascinating thing, John. It's a study from the University of Psycholinguistics in Amsterdam.
Right.
Sort of thing you and I
Nice,
discussed
yeah.
over pints, the psycholinguistic analysis, right? Max Planck Institute of Psycholinguistics in Amsterdam. It was a study by a woman called Shiri Lev-Ari. And it was about why our perception of foreigners and strangers. And it was about accents.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, right? So this study asked non-native people, right? Non-native English speakers.
Right.
Poles, Czechs, Russians, Africans of all sorts, Asians of all sorts, right? To say really banal expressions, right? And they recorded them, right? And they then played those really banal expressions like, can I have a cup of tea or something?
Right.
To native English speakers.
Yeah.
And they asked the native English speakers to listen and rank which person they thought was telling the truth or which person they believed.
Jesus.
Which person so it's very easy. They believed, right?
Yeah.
And what they found was that native English speakers, like us,
Yeah.
believe native English speakers much more than we believe people with heavy foreign accents.
Wow.
And it's really interesting,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then they thought, well, why is this? Like, what is the evolutionary trigger that makes us highly sensitive to accents? And actually, in our head, psychologically, ranks people's positions in terms of true credibility, truth, whatever. And they believe, obviously, that what actually happened is that accents, somebody who speaks differently to you, triggers some deep psychological alarm bells in our heads, right? Which is an evolutionary echo of our history. So if you think the history of humanity, we started with the history of humanity is one tribe conquering another.
Yeah.
You know, if you go all the way back,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Okay. And we all move around, one crowd invading another space. So what they're saying is that very, very deep in our psychology is this emotional alarm bell when it comes to people who sound foreign, because historically, meeting somebody who sounded different wasn't a good thing. Right?
Right.
It didn't end up well for one party, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that on top of all the economic issues are these deep emotional evolutionary issues, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's a fascinating. I must have a read of that.
Yeah,
but I wonder how much of that is nature and how much is nurture. You know, how much is programmed into that?
I think you're right, yeah.
All foreigners are a bit dodgy in some way or other, or not, you know, or how much is kind of passed on through millennia.
I think it's both. I think basically there's a little bit of anxiety passed on through millennia, and that is then reinforced by all sorts of, particularly by media comments.
Yeah.
You know, and reinforced by social comments.
Media, see, that's a really interesting point as well, because what I've noticed on a lot of radio stations, Irish radio stations, and I know it's the same in the UK and in newspapers, etc.,
and in America, which is got shock
well, of
culture.
Course, yeah. But I'm kind of discounting that. But is that everything is so polarized, everything is so black and white, so binary that you're either for or against. And if you voice a concern about immigration, oh my God, you're a far right racist type stuff. When in actual fact, in reality, everything is, we're talking about the legitimacy of concerns about immigration, and there are very legitimate concerns, but it's not on or off, right or left.
No, it's a blend. It's always a blend, and
it's in the grey.
It is in the grey, and you know that's the great Indian expression: in the dark, all cats are grey. So when things, you know, it's true. It's an interesting thing. All cats look grey in the dark, right? And the fascinating thing is that immigration. Okay, let's go. The movement of people and the movement of capital and the movement of goods are one and the same package. You cannot disentangle, right?
Yeah.
We have, rightly or wrongly, embraced globalization in this country. I think absolutely rightly, right? As this country, I've always said, people tend to say, oh, well, the Irish economy took off because Sean Lemass and T.K. Whittaker came up with some report. Bullshit. The Irish economy took off when we became open. And we became tolerant, and we allowed creative people to do their thing, and we didn't judge people's sexuality or morality or race.
Yeah.
And we said, you are welcome here. And people either stayed, Irish people who were creative and maybe were gay or maybe had a different lifestyle, they used to go to London, used to go to New York, they stayed here. So the correlation between liberalism, tolerance, openness, and economic performance is unambiguous, right? And this goes all the way back to the Dutch Republic of the late 16th, early 17th century. What you find is liberal democracy with kind of its wishy-washy, squidgy, centrist view. It'll be all right. Don't worry. We all get on together. Although it's not the sort of thing that people go over the barricades for.
Yeah.
But it's actually what has delivered amazing results over the years, right? And then you think it was like when Tyler Cowan was talking to us last week. Economic growth, yes, it's just a number, but what it does, it gives you a better lifestyle.
Yep.
It gives you better health, it gives you better education, it gives you better actually housing, it gives you better everything, right? So this is the thing to be protected. So we know that the liberal tradition is the font of all wealth creation. And we know that the illiberal tradition, i.e. putting up borders, being ethnocentric, being pure, being nationalists, is the route to disaster, which is precisely, if Irish people look at what happened in this country between 1922, when we got independence, right? And this year, 100 years, you can split Irish economic or social policy into two halves, except there won't be two halves. It's two Dave McWilliams halves. It's about 70 years on one end and 30 years. So the first half is 70 years, right? And then we were ethnically pure. We were Catholic. Yeah. We were as white as could be. We were milk white. We were factor 50 white.
Yeah, okay? Freckles and red hair.
Freckled Misha, right? Okay. We went backwards. We had mass emigration. We had poverty. We had child abuse. We had scandals. Crazy stuff, right? We had civil war in the north. We had mad stuff. It would be hard to imagine a country going backwards in Western Europe so quickly, and we did it. And then suddenly about 1990, Italian 90, we started opening up. We started saying, oh, well, let's get American companies in here. That'll be quite good. Yeah, well, that's foreigners here. Yeah, gay people. Yeah, you can stay. Yeah. And then we go on and we
eventually... It was after Bishop Eamon Casey got found out for having a kid in Boston. That's when it all changed.
But there are moments, right?
Yeah.
You know, and then we had divorce, then we have abortion, we have gay rights. All these are part of a package of, believe it or not, economic accelerators which drive the economy forward. That's where we are now. What the anti-immigration people are saying, we want to go back to some Ireland in the 1970s.
Yeah.
I'm like, man, can you remember what that was like?
Yeah.
Right?
I've no interest in that.
I have no interest in that. Yeah. But I have an interest in keeping a consensus together in the country and absolutely forcing out the far right. There is no economic study anywhere in the world, anywhere, that tells you that the far right delivers economic prosperity. The far right delivers poverty. That is the fact, going all the way back to the turn of the century, right? The far right delivers poverty, which is actually what's happening in Brexit. In the UK, the UK have embraced this, I think, reasonably far right agenda, right?
Yeah.
And they're going backwards.
Yeah, they are.
They're going backwards. And the only thing they say was, well, let's go back to the 1980s, or let's go back to this. They're going backwards because capital, talent, labour is saying, do you know what? UK, I'm not interested. So what we've got to do is nail the idea that liberalism causes the economy to grow. But at the same time, like the example at the very top of the show, we were talking about motor cars in America, certain people are badly affected. So what do you do about it? Obviously, you need an immigration policy. It's very, very explicit. What is in, what is out.
Yeah.
For economic migrants, for people who want to do well, who want to come here, number one. Then you need a refugee policy which says, okay, these are the checklists of things. You have to be coming from a country which is where your safety is in danger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? If I think our state says to Irish people, this is our refugee policy, open, transparent, but we'll police it. This is our migrant policy, our economic migrant policy, which is based on needing certain workers, okay? And EU membership means that everybody from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, can all come here freely. Then I think people will get it. And houses.
Well, I was just about to say that. Houses. Communicate the plan.
Yeah, tell people.
Plan it properly and communicate. That's where we've fallen down terribly over the last while, is a lack of communication and explaining to local communities what is happening, why it's happening, and what the short, medium, and long-term plan is. And
put refugees here in Dunleary.
Well, that's the other thing, is
in South
spread,
Dublin, where
the load.
You know,
so it's not, nobody can be accused of, well, that's not happening in
juries,
Littlefields.
Juries, put juries, the Bagot Street Hospital, all these places, down around here in Dunleary. So fellas from Finglas, don't think, okay, Dunleary, Dalkey, Killiney, Glasstool, Glenageary, all these wealthier parts of the city, they're not shouldering any of this burden.
Yeah.
We are. And that's what it's optics.
Absolutely. It is optics. And it's kind of, if we're all in this together and if we're all Irish, our culture and all the rest, well, then let's spread the load and let's all do our bit.
No, I think so, because, but to come back to the idea, the basic idea, which is absolutely crucial, is to also explain to people that this is part and parcel. You cannot cherry pick the global economy. You cannot say, we want this little nice bit, but we don't want that not nice bit.
Yeah.
We want all the wealth, but we don't want any of the responsibility, because that is what the far right are suggesting we can do. What they're suggesting is we can have prosperity and we can be ethnically pure. And that doesn't exist, A, because there's no example in the past, and B, because the way in which the economy grows and expands is through networks, right? And the network effects, this is something that most economists don't ever explain properly to people. They always think it's vertical, right? But basically, growth happens horizontally. It's actually all about networks and nodes and people chatting and trading and doing other things together. And if you want to be networked in the global economy, you have to have foreigners, because they're the people who create the network. I'll give you one last thing before we go, which is a fascinating thing on immigration. Who do you think are the most successful recent migrants in the United States?
Don't know.
Most people would say Chinese, Vietnamese, Asians in general.
Yeah.
Okay?
South Asians.
And before that, Jews, and before that, Irish, and all that sort of stuff, right? The most successful recent immigrant group in America, there's 375,000 of them, which isn't a lot in a country of 300 million, right? Are Nigerian Americans.
Oh, right. Okay.
So 61% of Nigerian Americans over the age of 25 hold a graduate degree compared to 32% of Native Americans. So they're twice as well educated, okay? Of Nigerian American professionals, 45% work in education, and many are professors at top universities. They're entering medicine at a much higher rate than any other immigrants, right?
Wow. Okay.
So you have African people are by far and away the most successful immigrants into the United States right now. And this again changes people's perceptions, right? Because the perceptions is African Americans are always in the lower socioeconomic group. On the contrary, and then the perception is all people who came from Africa, originated in Africa, are going to be by general poor.
Yeah.
On the contrary. So Nigerian Americans are the most successful, right? And this is the interesting thing about immigration, is that your perception, going back to this idea of foreigners and strangers, your perceptions can be rooted in complete falsehoods. And what you find when you drill down is things we thought would never happen. Economies we thought that would never grow. And ethnicities we thought were always going to be at the bottom of the pile, end up at the top of the pile. And that comes to your point of the great flux of humanity. If we in Ireland want a successful economy, we need to understand that immigration is part and parcel of that success. But equally, we've got to listen to those who feel left behind. Because if you don't listen to those who are left behind, they get angrier and angrier and angrier.